Movement is one of the most important aspects of a video game. With the majority of titles out there, it is the action players will perform more than any other, so creating a movement system that holds the player's interest is critical. While there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to what goes into good movement, it often centers around meaningful player interaction. This may come from having them jump between structures in the environment to reach new places, or string moves together in order to maintain momentum, or to regularly time button presses just right to get a little speed boost. Doing these things successfully calls for thoughtful player input, and is rewarded with fast and fluid movement. Players can't just hold forward and be done with it, as they are practically required to pay attention in order to move through a space effectively. This constant loop of needing to properly execute specific inputs and then being rewarded with efficient movement for doing so keeps players engaged, and it is both satisfying to pull off and exciting to watch, making it something they not only have to do, but want to do. What about games though, where the primary form of movement is riveting? Walking is possibly the most common type of movement in video games, and the action itself is almost always boring. It doesn't ask much of players, it's kind of slow, and it can end up accounting for a huge chunk of a title's runtime. Now, obviously not every game needs complex movement. Depending on what a title is trying to do, including that sort of thing could have a negative impact on other aspects, like gameplay or tone. What we conventionally see as good movement doesn't work for every game. For a lot of titles, walking is the right choice, and despite it not being all that interesting, many games that use it are still able to keep players invested while they traverse the world. So when it comes to these titles that don't rely on engaging movement mechanics, where it is mostly just walking, how do they keep players from getting disinterested while traveling? And the answer pretty much boils down to finding ways to distract players from noticing that the movement is actually boring. Many games handle this by densely packing their traditional gameplay sections together, the logic being that if players are constantly thrown into combat or puzzle solving or whatever mechanic a title is centered around, they won't have enough downtime to pay attention to potentially boring movement. With that said, when a game has virtually no downtime, it can become exhausting quickly. And while this is fine for certain genres, a lot of titles rely on having space for reflection, so cutting out sections that give players a little time to breathe isn't really an option, meaning developers have to put focus on making walking seem deeper than it is. This often starts by adding at least one additional layer of complexity to how movement works. Like in most games, instead of just being able to walk, players also have the option to walk slightly faster. Nice. This may not sound like much, but having multiple speeds a character can move accomplishes a handful of things. It allows for more precise controls, it gives players the chance to move at whatever pace they think is appropriate for the location they're in, it lets video essayists capture cool looking shots, and most importantly, it tricks people into thinking they're doing more than they actually are. Most players will almost always opt to move as quick as they can, so from a purely practical perspective, many games really only need to include that one speed. But by having multiple ones, players feel like they're maximizing their movement potential instead of just going at the default pace. Having options, however meaningless they actually are, gives players a greater sense of control. With including multiple speeds, there rarely is much to it in terms of mechanics. It's usually just holding down shift or tapping X or managing a stamina bar, but by being required to give some inputs, it distracts a bit from the lack of real gameplay. Furthermore, animation plays a role as well. Creating a walk cycle that feels natural to the character and is visually interesting has a lot of value, as players will be looking at it all the time. Obviously, there isn't one correct approach for animating a character's walk, but when considering how to hold a player's attention throughout a game, arguably the most important aspect is including unique walk animations for the various states and circumstances the character may find themselves in. Stuff like giving them a slight limp when heavily damaged, or making steps slow and labored when treading through snow or water. These sorts of details make movement more immersive, because the character is reacting to the things they encounter in an organic way. Even though there is no real mechanical impact, the variation in animations help to make it seem like there is. Along with all of this, a lot of titles also end up including movement options that aren't technically walking or running, but operate similarly. For instance, mechanically, activities like riding a horse in The Witcher 3 or canoeing in God of War 2018 aren't that different from walking. They cover ground faster and turn slower, but it's still mostly just pressing forward. However, it does break up the tedium that comes from staring at a character's back for hours as they jog along. As the movement looks different, this causes it to feel different as well, despite it pretty much being the same. Now, these sorts of things, while helpful, aren't enough to fully distract players from noticing that walking long distances is kind of boring. So more needs to be done to augment how they perceive movement. And one of the most effective ways of doing this is through the use of tension. Oh, thank God, nothing's here. When the player has some threat looming over them, their focus will naturally be drawn to it. Even though tension is just the preamble to something happening, that sense of rising anticipation for whatever may come pulls players in, distracting them from their actual movement, as they're more focused on whatever threat lies ahead. There are a handful of ways to accomplish this, whether it be mechanically, narratively, atmospherically, or a combination of the three. Personally, I think doing it mechanically is the strongest approach. When a system is built around the player avoiding danger, they have to both focus on their surroundings and use their limited mobility as effectively as possible in order to survive. A lot of games, primarily ones in the horror genre, achieve this kind of tension by including an unkillable monster that pursues the player, all but forcing them to be careful with how long they linger in certain areas and keep their head on a swivel as to look out for whatever thing is trying to kill them. Every step could be the one to give them away, creating an air of suspense that is tied directly to their movement. Also, as the playable character can only walk so fast, those inevitable chase sequences become all the more thrilling because escaping is not quick, easy, or guaranteed. Other games opt to use environmental threats to cultivate this kind of tension. Death Stranding does this pretty effectively through its timefall mechanic, which is a rain that causes the item Sam is carrying to deteriorate, and its BT areas, which are sections of the map that are riddled with dangerous monsters that will easily kill Sam if the player isn't properly prepared. When timefall starts, it causes players to either want to reach their destination as quickly as possible, or find a place to wait the rain out so their deliveries don't get destroyed. Every wasted moment might lead to failure, so players are pushed to take action. And this is where the BT areas often come into play, as many of them are conveniently placed along the most direct routes to various destinations. So players have to choose between taking the safer but longer route and risk the timefall ruining their packages, or cutting through the BT areas and chance getting attacked by an inky monster that could potentially kill them. The combination of these threats makes something as seemingly simple as choosing a path to walk become a crucial choice, keeping the player preoccupied while traveling across the map. Tension as a mechanic takes plenty of other forms, whether it be the threat of random encounters in an RPG, or the ever-shrinking circle in a battle royale game that the player needs to stay within, or a timer that brings about some consequence when it expires. Whatever the approach, what matters most is that it keeps players invested in what is going on so that they can't just hold forward and zone out. It gets them to use the movement they have, however limited it may be, in interesting and efficient ways. With that said, mechanical-based tension can get overwhelming if it happens non-stop, so it's important to find the right balance for how often it is used as to not exhaust players. While it's not as powerful of a technique, a game's narrative can also establish a similar sense of tension. When the stakes are raised in some way and the players put in a situation that feels urgent, moving from one place to the next gains a new sense of importance. Whether it be to save an ally or to reach a town before it's destroyed, as long as the player is invested in the world and story, these kinds of threats will pull them in. The time spent rushing to wherever they need to go will be filled with uncertainty of what may come next, and every slow step acts as a reminder that they may not get there in time. In general, it is most effective when this kind of tension comes from specific moments instead of some overarching threat, as it's harder to maintain tension long term. The downside to this kind of approach is that the urgency rarely actually matters. As most games have set stories, players can dick around pretty much whenever they want, and it changes nothing. The goal of sections like these is to make players believe that what's happening matters. So when that illusion is shattered, so is a lot of the tension. For many players, this won't be much of an issue, but for those who struggle to suspend their disbelief, it can cause problems. A similar thing can be said for using atmosphere to create tension. Sometimes just being in a place that feels menacing is enough to trigger that fight or flight instinct. And plenty of games use that to their advantage. There are a fair amount of titles that create play areas with all the trappings of dangerous and suspicious places, but without any actual threat. The walking sim genre is kind of famous for using this method. They often center around exploring abandoned houses, towns, ruins, or even space stations. Then there is almost always a sense that these places are haunted by something, or that the player is not alone. One of the earliest and best examples of this is Gone Home. For a good portion of the game, it feels like at any point a ghost could be right around the corner. The house is old and creaky. Rain constantly buffets the walls and is occasionally accompanied by thunder. It's spooky, and it makes walking through the house a bit terrifying. On my first playthrough, I rushed to every light switch I saw and dreaded any time I had to walk into a dark corridor. I played it in the same way I play horror games, slowly peeking around corners and stopping to listen to my surroundings. This made the moment-to-moment movement more exciting, even though I was never in any danger. Just feeling like I might be got me to be more thoughtful when moving through the space. The issue with this type of approach, though, is that once players realize there isn't anything to be afraid of, it loses a fair bit of its effectiveness. Generally, this is fine with shorter games or small sections of a larger title, but if it goes on for too long without any real payoff for the tension, it can end up feeling a bit hollow. While tension can be created solely from mechanics, narrative, or atmosphere, games are at their most tense when they weave all three together, as they fill in the gaps each have on their own. While the use of tension is a strong way to give more importance to walking, if there is never any release of the tension, it runs the risk of becoming grating. So to combat this, a lot of games juxtapose tension with Immaculate vibes. This may come in the form of a standout song playing as you travel, or a breathtaking view being along your path, or the sunset hitting just right. Whatever it may be, it makes you feel like you're in a capital M moment. It is the game telling players to reflect, to breathe, to focus less on where they're going and more just on the going. For these moments to work, they need to feel special, so they should be somewhat rare and fleeting in nature. When a moment feels important, players will become immersed in what is going on and focus less on the mechanics of something like walking and more on the general experience. When done well, it feels like a way to pass the time while traveling, and it serves to connect moments together in an enjoyable and memorable way. The far more common approach games use to cultivate this sense of passing the time is through talking. It may be from an audio log or the protagonist verbalizing every single thought that passes through their head, but most often it comes from conversations between characters. By pairing walking and talking together, it allows players to move from one traditional gameplay section to the next while also getting character and story development. In theory, melding narrative and gameplay together. At its best, it causes walking to feel more important as it progresses the story, and it doesn't take control away from the player as often as titles that have a lot of cutscenes do. However, the success of this heavily relies on the quality of a game's writing, because if what the characters have to say isn't interesting, players will just end up tuning them out. It can also lead to problems when the dialogue doesn't line up well with the character's movement. In almost every game that has a lot of walking and talking in it, at some point I either accidentally cut off a character mid-sentence by hitting a new zone, or have to stand around awkwardly waiting for them to finish talking. Along with that, depending on a character's AI, they might end up far behind or in front of the player, making it almost impossible to hear what they're saying. Obviously, with most titles, these issues are infrequent, but when they do happen, they pull players out of the moment, turning something that was meant to make the time pass faster into another thing to wait around on. In general, though, I think using dialogue during walking sections is an effective way to hold the player's attention, but it can easily be overused, and when walking sections seem to exist solely to deliver dialogue, it sometimes begs the question if a cutscene would have been better instead. It is also worth noting that just because a game has walking as the main form of movement, it doesn't mean that it can't be mechanically complex. Looking at Death Stranding again, players have to pay close attention to Sam's balance, constantly making adjustments with the trigger buttons so he doesn't eat shit. Along with these adjustments, it also leads to constant decision making in terms of where to walk, as different parts of the terrain pose various threats. If players aren't focused while traversing the world, they will be horribly ineffective. Now, the thing about this system and most others that bring mechanical depth to walking is that they are focused on giving consequences for failure instead of bonuses for success. Like, at the end of the day, the reward for having Sam maintain his balance is that he doesn't stop walking. So while it does keep the player engaged, it doesn't bring the same kind of joy that web slinging efficiently around New York does. It is meant to act as a potential disruption to movement, which works great for Death Stranding as its gameplay is designed around that idea, but understandably, it's an approach that most games with a lot of walking in them avoid, as it runs the risk of becoming irritating and immersion breaking. All in all, the best way to keep walking from feeling stale is by combining these strategies together in order to always present present the player with something new, so they don't get too used to any one thing. This all may seem like it's not that important, and for some players it's not. Even with games that do a good job of masking their boring movement mechanics, a large portion of players will still find them boring. Depending on what you value in a game, no amount of tension or vibes or talking or button inputs will distract you from a title's lack of conventional gameplay. For some players, these approaches will just never work. And that's okay. Not every game needs to be for every player. For those who it does work for though, including these elements is often the difference between a title feeling well-paced and bloated. They help keep folks engaged during a game's least engaging moments. And even though they won't draw in every player, the fact that they work for so many is a feat unto itself. It takes a lot of work to make any movement system, however simple it may seem, feel right. While it's easy to look at games with fast and frenetic action and assume that that is what good movement looks like, the reality is that good movement takes all sorts of forms, whether it be flying, swinging, parkouring, or even walking. And frankly, when a game is able to make something as simple and potentially tedious as walking feel engaging throughout its runtime, there are few things I find more impressive. And speaking of impressive, let's talk about this video's sponsor, Displate. I like to collect stuff from various games and shows I enjoy, and Displate has quickly become one of my favorite ways to do that. They print high-quality metallic posters of pretty much anything you can imagine. There are so many incredible designs to choose from, whether they be from licensed properties or original art by premium artists. The selection is astounding. And as they're made of metal, they don't tear or crinkle in the way that average posters do, which is a problem I've run into with literally every paper poster I've ever bought. On top of that, they're also incredibly easy to hang. You just put up the provided protective leaf to keep your wall from being damaged, attach the magnet to it, and then you're good to go. The best part about this system is that it is super easy to switch out posters, so anytime you want to change your wall art, it takes like 10 seconds. If you click the link in the description, you can get an awesome discount on any Displates you order. All in all, Displate is a great and simple way to collect and display stuff you love. So whether you're someone who currently has boring blank walls or are looking for something new to add to your collection, you should check them out. Thanks to Displate for sponsoring this video. With that, I hope you're well. Thanks to all my patrons who make this channel possible, and a special shout out to William Glenn H for being an honorary bagbuten. I appreciate you. Have a good day and or night, and I'll see you in the next one.